The idea of modernization, and like there's a critique, I think very legitimate critique from the indigenous movements that say like, we don't want your stupid modernization. We don't want you to stick your mines and your poisoned water and your dams all over our territory and call that modernization. You know, we don't want you to assimilate our children and impose English language or French language, educate your colonial languages on us. We don't want that kind of modernization. On the other hand, you have like China or, Cuba, you have, when they have like a universal literacy program, or China's successful attempt to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They would use the term modernization for building infrastructure and building out education. So how do you think about this idea of modernization in different contexts?
It's a tough discussion to enter into because the terms are easily misconstrued. I know there's a critique to be made of what is known as modernization theory. W. Rostow and other American political scientists after World War II, in the height of the Cold War, made the argument against communism, saying that societies need to be moved from tradition to modernity. That's modernization theory. There are roots in the sociology of Talcott Parsons. There are roots in various forms of positivist sociology of like tracking. Here's a traditional society, going back to 19th century Germany, where the idea was you move from Gemeinschaft or community to Gesellschaft, which is civil society. And the journey between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, or tradition to modernity, is something that has to happen, to bring us into this contemporary world, which is alienating and has its own isolations and problems and so on. There's a tradition in European social thought, there's a tradition in political thinking in general about this great transition.
And how about in communist theory? Like, do communists adopt that stage theory of like or whatever, tribal and then states and advanced civilizations? Is that a debate? How would you define the debate within the communist literature, I guess, on that question?
It actually doesn't map onto this at all, because you see, this theory suggests that somehow modernity, which becomes coterminous to capitalism, is the big break from an older history, from the past. But in fact, many of the people who make the claim for modernity do it in a very constrained way. It's modernity generally for Europeans, where they are able to transcend their culture. Because that's part of the idea, is that you have to be able to break out of your community. You have to become an individual, as it were. And that has to do with capitalism, with market relations, with the way you enter the market as an individual, with your merits and so on. This is there very much in Max Weber and others. That's one whole tradition of thinking. But at the same time, they say that the so-called quote-unquote barbarians, those who had been colonized, they don't have the cultural wherewithal to break from their tradition and become, modern. And there are many, accounts in the 1950s of anthropologists and sociologists who traveled to India, traveled to Nigeria. They write books about the blockage of modernity because these cultures are an impediment. Now, that's interesting because, in fact, they are reproducing colonial thought. In the colonial times, colonial leaders would come to, these parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, into Eastern Europe even, and they would say things like, look, these people cannot be made into modern. The most we can do is we can sort of train them to live in the modern world. They can't become modern, but they can live in the modern world. We'll extract resources from them.
As it
and
happens,
so on.
They can live as our slaves, more or less. Or
yeah, exactly. They have a different standard of living. I mean, when in 1984, when the Union Carbide factory exploded in Bhopal in India, an American executive said, look, Indians have a different idea of life. Their notion of human life is different. If 3,000 Indians die in an explosion, well, they think they'll be born again and so on. We don't need to worry about it so much. But if one American dies, that's horrendous. And by the way, this calculation is seen in wars that the United States conducts. If a US soldier is killed, that's an abomination. If 500 civilians are killed, well, we're sorry you died. But you have a different attitude to life. So that colonial thinking is very much there in modernization theory. In this theory that, capitalism can come to these parts of the world, but let's face it, they don't need to be paid too much in India. Those workers, they can live in wretched conditions, and caste hierarchies can be reproduced to help maintain capitalist structures. We'll have these oppressed castes do that occupation and so on. This was mapped on to Indian reality. I'm giving you the Indian example because I know that best of all. In the communist tradition, the idea was you have to break radically from the social hierarchies of the past. Not that you go from community to individualism, you go from social hierarchy to social equality. You don't go to individualism, you go to a social world where people are not tormented by the wretched hierarchies of the past. Hierarchies reinforced by religion, by race, by caste, by patriarchy, and so on. So the communist transition period goes from social hierarchy, the wretchedness of those hierarchies, to social equality. So actually it's quite different. Now, the thing is that maybe we suffer from a problem of language. What do we call that communist transition, from social hierarchy to social equality? Well, we call it to some extent modernization. Why should we allow, people, the capitalist groups to basically take over, monopolize the concept of modernity? We say it's a form of modernization, socialist modernization. Why? Because part of the modernization is improving the basic conditions of people's lives. You got to improve things like literacy levels. You got to improve things like access to, running water, so that because of the nature of patriarchy, women spend hours going to collect water. Their leisure time is reduced. Their capacity to study is reduced. Their capacity to engage other people is reduced.
Yeah.
So all of that is part of socialist modernization.
And literacy, right? So like in a lot of communist revolutions, there is a program to make sure that girls and women learn to read at the same rates as men. And there's often a lot of resistance to that in rural areas. We've been talking about Afghanistan for a while. And that whole thing that came up, Anand Gopal wrote this article called The Other Afghan Women, where he was talking about why women accepted the Taliban, like over the American, constant bombing and destruction of their villages. And they thought at least the Taliban could, put an end to this. But he was talking about, he goes back to the 70s in this village. And in the village, he says, the communists sent these teachers, and then the people slit all the teachers' throats. And then the communists got mad and arrested them all, and they were never seen again. And it's like, well, you did slit all the teachers' throats. Like there was repression, but it wasn't repression because of, we were trying to force you to send your kids to school. It was repression because you murdered the teachers. Like, what's the punishment for murder in any country?
Well, also that story is not accurate how it's told. I spent a lot of time talking to Anahita Ratevzad, who ran some of those literacy programs, have explored these things in Afghanistan and so on. After the Saur Revolution in 1978, April 1978, one of the key features of that new revolutionary government was we got to educate the public. The education levels were abysmally low, both for men and women. So 15,000 communists and sympathizers and teachers went out into rural areas extremely bravely because they had to confront the landlords. They had to confront conservative men. They had to confront conservative religious leaders. And eventually they had to confront the Mujahideen funded by the Pakistanis, the Saudis, and the United States come across the border from Pakistan and, attack them. These were very brave people, 15,000 of them. And thousands of them either lost their lives or were kidnapped and never seen again. Many were kidnapped, and God knows what happened to them. Were they taken to Pakistan? Were they, forced to do whatever? I don't know. We don't know. These are brave people. What were they doing wrong? They were out there trying to bring literacy and education in the countryside, and they were confronted not by the people. That's why I said that the story is wrong. They were not confronted by the people. They were confronted by landlords, by religious clerics, by conservative figures who said, we don't want education for our serfs. Because let's face it, in rural Afghanistan in the 1960s and 70s, land relations were appalling, and most of the landless workers had to work as serfs. They were indebted bond slaves and so on. And when the communists and the teachers and others came to the countryside to conduct literacy classes amongst the bond slaves and so on, landlords didn't want that. This was a great threat to what they saw as their property. So which side are you going to stand on there? Are you going to stand with the landlords and with the mullahs and, with the conservatives, or with these people who want education? I'm not saying stand with the teachers. The people who want education, the bond slaves and so on. That's why I reject the characterization. The people rejected the teachers. Not true. There's a class struggle in the countryside. And the teachers came on the side of one class against another, and they were killed because they did that. Now, is this modernization? To my mind, yes. But it's also the advance of society.
Right.
Are you against that?
I want to add two more examples. One is obviously from Fan Shan, which is this documentary of the Chinese Revolution in a village. It's a book. It's a big book by William Hinton. And I gathered later that William Hinton's daughter, lived in China and speaks fluent Chinese and participated in the government. But anyway, Hinton wrote this thing, and it's like land reform. It's the way people pressed for land reform during the Chinese Revolution. And he talks quite a bit about the conditions before the revolution, where, as a peasant, you have to go to the bathroom on the landlord's toilet, because he is not just entitled to your labor and your time, but he's also entitled to your bowel movements, because that becomes night soil, which is his right. If you're working for him, that's his right. So landlords hate that. So that's what do you call that? Do you call that changes in that condition modernization? That's one. Another example I wanted to add was the US after the Civil War, the Reconstruction. That was when public education arrived in the US, especially in the South. But most of the public education in the US starts after slavery is abolished, after the Civil War. And again, people were dragged kicking and screaming to education because the elite, the Southern elite and the racist elite despised it. And it was Black people who wanted education and demanded education that, that led to that. And so, and then, I just wanted to make a complete and utter contrast, which I think you will agree, I'm setting you up to agree, with what Canada does and did with Indigenous children. That has nothing to do with modernization. It has nothing to do with education. They were kidnapping these children and taking them to these places where they died in huge numbers and burying them in unmarked graves. And they were doing that with some kind of religious justification. But ultimately, they said, we are doing this to kill the Indian in the child. We are doing this to get a final solution to the Indian problem. That's fascism. That's the opposite of socialist or communist modernity, the opposite, in the sense that these people are fighting to the death all over the world, these two projects. So
I'm really glad you brought up William Hinton's book, Fan Shan. I recommend to people another book, 10 Mile Inn by Isabel Crook and David Crook. In fact, I met Isabel in Beijing just a few years ago. There were a group of Americans like William Hinton and others. Many of them studied at the Putney School in Vermont as children. And they went to China. They were, socialists in one way or the other. Many of them worked in Chinese media So did Isabel Crook. But 10 Mile Inn is as good a book as Fan Shen. I met William Hinton toward the end of his life. All of them were struck by the way in which the Chinese Revolution, the people involved in the Chinese Revolution, were angry with the cultural practices of their past, from foot binding to deference to landlords. You know, when the Chinese Revolution succeeds and Mao is there at Tiananmen Square, the phrase he uses is captivating. He says, China has stood up. You know, the idea of standing up is important. When Thomas Sankara takes power in Upper Volta in a coup d'etat in 1983, one of the first things Sankara does is he changes the name of the country. He says, Upper Volta, that's a colonial name. We don't live north of the Volta River. We are the land of upright people, Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. And then Mao says, China stands up. It stood up because, you know, the idea of being hunched in front of a landlord, compulsory hunching. When a landlord comes by, you have to bow down. You have to bow your head. Look, eyes have to be averted. You know, your family is from Kerala. In Kerala, there were hideous cultural practices that the landlords and Brahmins enforced. People had to look down. Their shadow couldn't touch a Brahmin. They couldn't open an umbrella on the road. They couldn't walk on the main road. They had to walk on side roads. Women couldn't wear a top. They had to have their breasts exposed and so on. This wretched kind of culture that we inherited in 10 Mile Inn, Isabel and David Crook write with great feeling of the anger of the peasantry as they come into some authority and they say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. Sorry, we are going to transform our culture. Now, what do you call this? You call this the advance of a society. This is a people saying we are going to reject it. And it's a class struggle. It's about a certain class that has been suffocated, saying we want to breathe. That's why I like that phrase a lot, land of upright people in Sankara's, thing. Yeah. Or Mao saying, stand up straight.
Well, and I think that's a great thing because, historically speaking, because he didn't just say, Chinese people have stood up. He said China has stood up. And he's referring to stood up after the so-called century of humiliation, the long century of humiliation that starts with the Opium Wars, the destruction of the Summer Palace, the basically sponsoring both sides of the Tianping rebellion, the Taiping rebellion, the famines that they imposed. If you late Victorian Holocaust has a little bit of this. That we're talking about tens of millions of people, of Chinese people who died, just like Indian people who died from these famines at around the same time during this century. Wars and destruction, and that is actually when Hong Kong became a colony of Britain. I just want to clarify, Hong Kong and the whole discussion of what happened in Hong Kong a couple of years ago because of the security law that China was imposing, which is pretty much the same type of law that many countries in the world have, but and the repression that went on when China was repressing the movement against that law, which again was far, far less than you'd see in the U.S. during the George Floyd rebellion, or everyday normal violence in the U.S., not even during a war. But I just wanted to say, Hong Kong specifically, that history, there's a little bit too much colonial nostalgia for how great things were under the British. That I see when people are talking about Hong Kong.
The first thing I want to say, because you've raised it in this way, Justin, is that in India, when India wins its independence and the partition takes place, and India is then created as a republic in 1947, independence, 1950, we have a constitution and become a republic. 11 years later, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru tells the Indian military to get ready. They line up in Western India and they march into 3 parts of India to militarily seize them back into Indian territory. And that's the areas of Goa, Daman and Diu, which were Portuguese colonies. So the Indian government in 1961 walks into Goa and liberates Goa from Portuguese rule.
Were there tanks, Vijay?
But they might have very well
been tanks.
This is in 1961. This is 2 years after the People's Liberation Army second time enter into the province of Tibet. The first time was in 1950. In 1959, the Potala, the palace is now under civilian rule, no longer under the rule of the lamas. 1959. But in India, this happens in 61. And by the way, nobody talks about it. It's interesting. The Chinese government in 1961, 62, 63 did not walk into Hong Kong. They waited till 1997 when effectively the lease ran out. I mean, the Chinese government actually followed the terms of the lease that had been there with the British government. What's interesting is, okay, they followed the terms of the lease. The last Governor General of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, who, by the way, oversaw the colony without any democratic rights, is now a regular guest on the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, a regular guest, complaining about the lack of democracy in Hong Kong. BBC is one of the lead journalistic houses, just as it reported appallingly on Zimbabwe. Lots of colonial nostalgia for what was previously Rhodesia, lots of nostalgia. In the same way...
who's that named after? Rhodesia, what's that?
Exactly. Who is that named after? There's a question. Even Wikipedia entry is not bad. Go check out who is Rhodesia named after. Well, in Hong Kong, in the case of Hong Kong, 1997, that's when the so-called lease expires and Hong Kong comes back to territorial control of the Chinese government, which it had been before the lease. It's not like, some mysterious thing.
And the lease wasn't the lease was one of the unequal treaties. Again, something to look up for listeners. Look up the unequal treaties.
But they still honored it.
Yeah,
I mean, exactly. Indian government didn't honor anything, just walked into Goa and took it back.
Yeah.
And the people of Goa, there were people who were upset to move to Portugal. So it's not the case that, in Goa, people were all thrilled. It's also the case when the lease expired in 97, there were lots of people in Hong Kong who didn't want to leave Britain. They wanted to be part of Britain. That happens in all colonies, okay? When the colonial situation takes place, people collaborate with the colonial leaders, then they want to go with them. That happens all the time.
It's also the colonial education system, honestly.
It's the colonial education system.
It's an education system that's designed not for modernization, but to prepare people to be, what the colonizer needs them to be.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't disparage the people that say, okay, I'm going off to England now. You go, that's fine. Yeah. The issue is, Britain, in a sense, wants to maintain Hong Kong as a permanent colony. That's the real issue. One good thing you can say is that, when the Portuguese dictatorship was confronted with Indian takeover of Goa, they couldn't react. They might have tried, but they couldn't, because a big country like India decided to come in. So interesting. On the African continent, on the other hand, at the same time, the Portuguese were brutal in Guinea-Bissau. When Amilcar Cabral and his comrades first began, they began as a non-violent movement. They experienced massacres in Mozambique. This is all in the 1960s, just after India walked into Goa. No European or US power came out there and put pressure on Lisbon not to behave like that. And the Portuguese government treated Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, they treated the people there as simply less than human. They animalized labor. I'm being very deliberate in my use of words. They did not treat people as human beings. And there was no criticism of the Portuguese colonial experience, which only ended because the people of Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau threw them out in 1974.
1974, you guys. 1974. Angola was a colony until 1974.
Yeah, and it's because the people of Africa overthrew the colonial yoke in these countries that the people in Portugal overthrew their dictatorship. Troops who went to fight in Angola, fight in Mozambique, came back totally desolate. And they were part of the struggle to overthrow the Salazar dictatorship.
So would you say then that Africa helped Portugal to modernize, in a sense?
I would say that it was the cause, it was the African national liberation movements that brought democracy to Portugal. And the Portuguese should every day get on their knees and rather than thank Salazar and the dictatorship or even the first government, democratic government that came, they should thank the people of Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and so on for, in fact, giving Portugal democracy. They would never have had democracy, so easily as they did because of the struggles in this part of the world. Well, let's go back a little bit because there were some serious problems in Xinjiang and in other provinces in China where there were large numbers of minority peoples. When in 1978, when China had a reform era open up under Deng Xiaoping, there was an understanding that China had to grow the economy. It had to increase productivity, it had to increase its scientific and technological know-how and so on, because there was impending stagnation, because after a point you can't keep redistributing whatever surplus you have. You have to produce a surplus and so on. That was in 1978. By the early to mid 1990s, there was a recognition that a lot of disparities had crept in. One of the great disparities was the disparity in areas far from the Pacific, coastal region. So, not only Xinjiang, but Kunming and other provinces were not getting the kind of benefits that the Pacific provinces were getting. That was one problem. Secondly, there seemed to be an increase in poverty among minority peoples. That was an issue on the table and had been, to be fair, an issue on the table in the 1950s. When the Dalai Lama was the chairperson of the National Minorities Commission in Beijing, they had already discussed disparities of minorities and so on, but there was really no agenda to pick that up. This was not taken that seriously, in fact, until the early 2000s, when again this came on the table. There was a suggestion, well, we've got to look west, we've got to develop western provinces and so on. At that time, there were grievances in Xinjiang, no question about it. There were lots of grievances. And it turned out, unfortunately, that because of the war in Afghanistan, because of the really quite horrendous groups that had developed in Central Asia, including the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, brutal group, and so on. Many of these young, disgruntled, people from Xinjiang went off to Central Asia, and then they went into the kind of Jihad International, cutting their teeth in Libya. I met many of these people in Syria. Now they are all, the headquarters of their movement is in Idlib. It's not in Xinjiang. It's not even in Central Asia. It's not in Afghanistan. It's in Idlib, Syria. That's the headquarters. I met them on the border of the Turkey and Syria. They had been involved in various attacks. They had been part of ISIS, some of them. Some of them had been in various Al-Qaeda groups, Jabhat al-Nusra in the its earlier iteration and so on. These men mainly came back to Central Asia. They got into Xinjiang. They conducted terror activities and so on. But I also want to say that they were produced by a problem, which was this kind of neglect of the region, the kind of increasing levels of disparity. When Xi Jinping comes to office in 2013, he develops this theory of one belt, one road. And then eventually it gets called the Belt and Road. And they push hard, on trying to eliminate as many disparities as possible, and particularly to eliminate disparities that are faced by minority people. So the poverty, the abolition of extreme poverty, Xi Jinping and others are on record. China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty since 1949. The last 100 million were the hardest to find their way out, largely because many of them were ethnic minorities, where they had been neglected. And face it, there are some problems. There are social hierarchies in China that had to be confronted. Mao wrote about this in the early years. We've got to stop Han chauvinism. This is a lot like Lenin's writings against great Russian chauvinism. We've got to confront the fact that there are these chauvinisms and so on. So Xi Jinping put a lot of emphasis on trying to get rid of disparities between the majority population and the minorities. And this is where Xinjiang becomes, in a sense, ground zero. So does Kunming, so do other provinces. So what you see actually is a combination of various things. Poverty alleviation, you see this whole, re-education of people who have been, seduced into some of these terroristic kind of Islamic groups and so on. It's a combination of all these things happening in Xinjiang now. Now, what's partly frustrating is that the kind of communication that comes from Washington, D.C. and other places about what's happening in Xinjiang is unwilling to entertain its complexities. It's unwilling to entertain the issue of minorities who are fighting, themselves to get out of poverty, fighting themselves to improve their conditions. I mean, one of the interesting features, just let me finish. Yeah. One interesting feature of this, Justin, is the question of mechanization. There was a statement made of slave labor in southern Xinjiang, in the cotton belt. Well, I would like to see John Deere come out and make a public statement about the number of heavy machinery it has sold the government and private companies in southern Xinjiang. John Deere has made a lot of money selling heavy machinery in that part of the world. If you have heavy machinery in the cotton production, what slave labor? I talked to a professor at Urumqi on this issue. She has written a PhD on this. She says, well, look, there are great problems for the laborers. There are lots of problems, just as there are problems for workers all across the world, but it doesn't come to the level of slavery or anything like that. There are struggles that must be taken seriously, but it's different than saying, it's slavery, it's genocide. These are very difficult words, and in fact, rather than elucidate, they shut off discussion.
You were very euphemistic when you said the literature coming out of Washington is unwilling to confront the complexities. The literature coming out of Washington comes from one psychotic Christian evangelical end times guy named Adrian Zenz. And it's not just unwilling to confront the complexities, it's willing to make up stuff out of whole cloth. So it's the information is so bad, it's really hard to assess or believe any claim that the U.S. makes out about what's going on in and that's true for Iran, it's true for Yemen, it's true for Venezuela or Cuba, but it's also very true for China.
Well, the sad part of it is that, they manipulate the reality where there are bits and pieces of truth. There are bits and pieces of truth which are put under heavy concepts that make you feel like something horrible is transpiring. The bits and pieces of truth. There have been neglect of minority people. Nobody is denying that in Beijing. In fact, there are documents written about this that directed people in the poverty alleviation campaign to focus on the question of minority disparity. So they take that, little bits and pieces of the disparity literature, or they take bits and pieces of the fact that, the Chinese government is going after people who've been influenced by this ideology, the kind of jihadist ideology. Look, we're talking, this is the 20th anniversary of Guantanamo's being set up. I'm not saying that there's a perfect way to deal with the fact of some sort of ideology that is committed to mass murder or whatever. I don't know if there's a perfect way to do it, but certainly this is not as bad as going and wholesale bombing a country into extinction. Even what the Russians did in Chechnya, you're not seeing that in Xinjiang. I mean, what the Americans did in Iraq, what the Russians did in Chechnya, what the British did during colonial times, where they just said, we're going to go and bomb the savages. Yeah. You don't see that happening in Xinjiang. Whatever you see, it may trouble your appetite, it may be a problem and so on, but it's certainly not, it doesn't rise to the level of the kind of terrible violence that we saw in Iraq, that I saw in Iraq. I saw how almost every family in Baghdad was marked by the killing, marked by, the trauma of that war, which, I don't even know if it's over yet, Justin. That's the thing. Or the kind of behavior of the dirty wars in Central America in the 1980s. None of this rises to that standard.
Well, and I mean, like the cultural genocide accusations also don't hold up. There's language, there's signage, there's language education in Uyghur. It's like the accusation seems to be that if you're learning Mandarin as a second language, that's cultural genocide. Meanwhile, again, like in Canada, indigenous nations have been demanding education in their own languages for at least 2 generations. And it's like, we here in the wealthiest country in the world, we can't find the money for it. But China, where the per capita income is far lower, they find resources to keep the language not just alive, but to make sure that every Uyghur kids have education in their own language.
I mean, the behavior of the Indian government in Kashmir is far worse than anything that I have seen in some of these provinces. And by the way, you use the phrase cultural genocide. Yeah. In international law literature, there is no such phrase. There is a convention against genocide. Genocide should not be minimized. Yeah. That's where you kill people, where you come in to do ethnocide, genocide, the killing of an entire people. There's been a long debate in the UN about the term cultural genocide. It's rejected. Article 2 of the Convention on Genocide actually has something interesting. It talks about how it's a crime to take children away from their families and put them somewhere else and educate them. Hello, that's the experience of Canada.
They said that because of Canada.
Exactly.
That's not an abstract thing. They put that in there because of Canada.
That's Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. The term cultural genocide has been rejected over the years. In fact, the most, closest it came into the various UN things was when there was a deliberation about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There was a discussion about whether the term cultural genocide should be brought in. This is in 1994 in Article 7. I remember this as if it was yesterday, this debate, because I have had strong feelings about how people's culture is taken away from them and so on. The term was not adopted because, again, lots of countries felt, let's not minimize the concept genocide. That means the killing of people, taking away of your culture. This is now entering a complicated area. Because you see, you could then argue, Justin, the Indian government, a right-wing Indian government could argue anti-Brahminism is cultural genocide. You can't commit genocide against Brahmins. Brahmins should be allowed to exercise their culture. For God's sake, I want to obliterate Brahmin culture. Brahmin culture...
Right. The culture of you can't look this person in the eye and you can't eat with them and you can't...
Yeah, why can't somebody turn around and say patriarchy is my culture? No, patriarchy is not your culture. We are going to fight patriarchy and bring it out from the ground, all the root of it. And so that's the reason why cultural genocide, there was hesitancy because people knew what will happen is, and remember this is 1994, this debate has been going from 1948, Convention on Genocide, till the 90s, right through the period of the 1960s when new cultural forms were appearing. People were talking about women's rights, people were talking about gay rights, people were talking about the rights of minorities and so on. All of that was on the table. Now, why couldn't the white supremacist government in South Africa, the apartheid government, say, my God, our culture is apartheid?
They did. The South, the peculiar institution, the U.S. South, that was one of their main arguments, right?
Right. So this is the reason why the term cultural genocide did not become law, because there was great hesitancy. Because you and I know, other people know, people who suffer from the other side of culture know that there are some things that we have to rip out root and branch, root and branch. In Tibet, for instance, until, right through when the lamas were in charge, the wretched feudal condition for the serfs must be recognized and put on the table. Whatever you feel about the role of the Dalai Lama in the world and so on, the wretched way in which the lamas ran Tibet has to be put on the table. Now, I don't believe that necessarily, all cultural artifacts or heritages and so on. I was very upset when I saw the Bamiyan Buddhas get blown by the Taliban. It's a great resource of humanity. We don't want to destroy that. We don't want to destroy museums. But the social relations of hierarchy, Justin, social relations of hierarchy, we are not zoo animals, okay? We don't want to have that shit preserved. We want to destroy it. Call it modernization, call it whatever you want. But if you start calling that cultural genocide, you will drift immediately to the right. Yeah. Because you will then give an opening to Mr. Narendra Modi to say, caste is our culture, and therefore any attempt to get rid of caste is the genocide of our culture. God forbid you take that position.